For 30 years, Johnny Carson's couch made legends with a single gesture and destroyed careers with equal precision. 6 comedians earned an invitation during their debut. All 6 became household names. But cross him once, you were erased forever. The couch that ruled Hollywood. Carson's own son, Rick, later wrote, "My father destroyed careers before breakfast and never mentioned it at dinner. He kept lists in his head, and once your name went on the wrong list, you were finished." For 30 years, from 1962 to 1992, those lists determined everything. The Tonight Show dominated American television with a nightly audience of 10 to 12 million viewers. If you wanted to reach middle America, you went through Johnny Carson. The real prize was an invitation to sit on the couch beside Carson's desk. A comedian would perform a 5 or 6 minute set while Carson watched from behind his desk. The studio was kept at 64 degrees, cold enough that hands would shake. If the material landed, Carson might offer the okay hand gesture basic approval, nothing more. But most comedians would finish their set, take their bow, and watch Carson transition to a commercial break. The couch remained out of reach. The walk back to the dressing room after a set that didn't earn the couch was its own kind of punishment. You could hear the audience still applauding politely, warmly even, but you knew. Carson had smiled, nodded, maybe said very funny, and then turned to camera. The couch sat there, empty, 10 feet away, close enough to touch. You were not invited. Over 30 years of hosting, Johnny Carson invited exactly 6 debut comedians to sit on that couch during their first appearance. 6 out of thousands. Carson's background as a magician meant precision and craft were everything. And his famously aloof personal demeanor meant approval was never given lightly. When Carson gestured for a comedian to join him during their debut, the invitation functioned as a self-fulfilling prophecy. If Johnny Carson believed in you publicly, before an audience larger than most American cities, then America believed in you too. Booking agents called. Club owners upgraded your billing. Television producers suddenly returned phone calls. Those 6 were Freddie Prinze, Ellen DeGeneres, Stephen Wright, George Carlin, Bill Cosby, and Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers, who Carson would later destroy so completely that witnesses say she never fully recovered. Carson's power worked both ways. The first name on his list of stars he created would eventually become the first name on his list of those he destroyed. And it all began on a February night in 1965. You're going to be a star. At 31 years old, Joan Rivers knew this was her last chance. The industry had given up on her. Tonight, she would either become a star or disappear forever. You're going to be a star. 5 words that changed everything. But 14 minutes earlier, Joan Rivers was convinced her career was over. Rivers arrived at 30 Rockefeller Plaza on February 17, 1965, carrying the weight of an industry that had effectively dismissed her. At 31, she was considered past her prime in a business that barely tolerated female comedians at any age. She'd been grinding through small comedy clubs for years, working hostile audiences and building material one painful set at a time. Club owners were making it clear, her window was closing. If she couldn't connect with Carson tonight, the chances would stop coming. 31 was old for a female performer in 1965. 32 would be ancient. She took the stage and delivered her material with the precision of someone who had performed these jokes hundreds of times. Her hands trembled, the microphone picked up the shake, but something was different tonight. Carson wasn't offering the polite chuckle hosts give struggling performers. He was genuinely laughing, leaning back in his chair, making eye contact with Ed McMahon to share the moment. Rivers could feel the set building, each joke landing harder than the last. Then Carson leaned forward into the microphone and spoke 5 words that would change her life. You're going to be a star. Rivers stood on that stage, momentarily speechless, as the studio audience erupted. As she walked off stage, Ed McMahon leaned over to Carson and whispered, "You sure about that?" Carson didn't hesitate. Bet your house on it. Rivers became one of Carson's most frequent guests, appearing nearly 100 times over the years. 1978. Carson's mother passed away on Tuesday. He called Rivers, "I need you to host. I can't face the audience." She hosted for a week while he attended to his family. 1983. NBC executives wanted to replace her as permanent guest host. Carson walked into their meeting. "Joan stays or I start talking to ABC." She stayed. Carson eventually made Rivers his primary guest host, the comedian he trusted to sit in his chair when he took vacations. The woman the industry had dismissed as too old at 31 became one of comedy's most recognizable voices, all because Johnny Carson had seen what the industry missed. Rivers never forgot that debt. For 21 years, she remained fiercely loyal to Carson, defending him publicly, supporting him privately, building her career in his shadow. But 21 years of loyalty can end in a single phone call. And when that call came in 1986, Joan Rivers made a decision that would destroy everything Carson had built for her and everything they'd built together. The betrayal that ended everything? The offer was everything Rivers had ever wanted. Her own show, her own desk, a chance to step out from Carson's shadow. There was just one problem: it would air opposite The Tonight Show, and she never told him. For 21 years, Joan Rivers was Carson's chosen successor. But loyalty meant nothing the day Carson learned about her betrayal from a TV Guide reporter. The offer arrived in 1986. Fox Network wanted Joan Rivers to host her own late-night talk show, The Late Show, starring Joan Rivers, airing opposite The Tonight Show. For Rivers, the opportunity was enormous, a chance to build her own legacy instead of forever being Carson's guest host. But accepting meant competing directly with the man who had made her career possible. Rivers made her decision without informing Carson beforehand. She negotiated the contract, finalized the deal, and prepared to announce her new show, all while Carson remained unaware. Carson was in his dressing room when a TV Guide reporter called. "Johnny, can I get a comment on Joan's new show?" Carson's hand froze on the receiver. "What new show?" The reporter went silent, realizing, "Oh God, you didn't know." For a man who valued loyalty above almost everything else, the method of her departure cut deeper than the departure itself. Carson never spoke to Joan Rivers again. But Carson's response went far beyond personal silence. He used his institutional power to ensure Rivers' professional failure, implementing a ban so systematic it became legendary in Hollywood. The rule was absolute. Anyone who appeared on The Late Show starring Joan Rivers was permanently barred from The Tonight Show. Actors promoting new films had to choose appear on Rivers' fledgling show or maintain access to Carson's audience. For emerging performers who needed Carson's validation, there was no choice at all. Rivers found herself unable to book A-list guests, unable to compete with Carson's roster of stars. In month 1, she booked 3 A-list guests. Month 2, 1. Month 3, 0. Without access to top-tier talent, her ratings suffered. Without strong ratings, Fox lost confidence. The show was canceled within a year. Ed McMahon tried to broker peace in 1989. Carson's response was ice cold. "Ed, I love you like a brother. But if you mention her name again, we're done too." Rivers sent Carson a handwritten apology in 1990. He returned it unopened, with a note to his assistant. "Return to sender, no exceptions." They never spoke again. The chosen daughter had committed an unforgivable sin, and Carson's capacity for permanent grudges proved as powerful as his capacity for creating stars. If Carson could do that to the woman he once called his successor, imagine what he did to comedians he barely knew. Like the woman who made history on the worst day of her life and became the first to break a barrier that had stood for 24 years. Making history on the worst day, her car had just flipped onto its side. She had 3 hours until the biggest audition of her life, and Ellen DeGeneres was about to break a record that no woman had broken in 24 years of The Tonight Show. Ellen DeGeneres was scheduled to appear on The Tonight Show in 1986, on a day that had already gone catastrophically wrong. Hours before she was supposed to arrive at the studio, her car parked on one of Los Angeles' notoriously steep hills had its parking brake fail. She watched through a window as it rolled backwards, smashing into 3 parked cars before flipping onto its side. Total loss. She had 3 hours until the biggest audition of her life. No time to process, no time to grieve the car, no time to prepare mentally, just insurance companies, mechanics, and the sick feeling that comes from watching your vehicle destroyed. She arrived at 30 Rockefeller Plaza shaken, her confidence rattled. First appearances on Carson were rare enough. Second chances for comedians who failed to connect were virtually non-existent. Carson's producer pulled her aside. "If you bomb, we're cutting your segment short. We'll go to commercial after 2 minutes." She took the stage and began her material, fighting through the stress and distraction. Her observational style connected immediately with the audience. The laughs came easily, building through the set. Then, halfway through, Ellen's mind went blank. The next joke, gone. She stood there, silent, for 3 full seconds. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Carson leaned forward, watching. And then Ellen said, "Well, this is going great," and turned her panic into a bit. The room exploded with laughter. Carson knew right then she was special. As DeGeneres finished her set and prepared to take her bow, Carson did something he'd never done for a female comedian on their debut. He gestured for her to join him at the desk. The studio audience erupted in applause. DeGeneres was making history, becoming the first woman in 24 years to receive a couch invitation during her debut appearance on The Tonight Show. The conversation that followed was relaxed and genuine, with Carson treating DeGeneres as a peer whose material he respected. That endorsement, delivered to everyone who mattered in Middle America, kickstarted DeGeneres' career in ways that would have been impossible without Carson's public approval. On her worst day, fighting through personal chaos and stress, Ellen DeGeneres had delivered comedy strong enough to make history. But Carson didn't just champion mainstream success. Sometimes, he bet his career on comedians the industry thought were too weird to succeed. 5 years before Ellen's historic invitation, Carson made a bet industry executives said would end his credibility forever. The comedian was too strange, too quiet for late-night television. His name was Stephen Wright, and Carson didn't just invite him to the couch. He did something he'd never done before and never did again. The comedy revolutionaries. The industry said surrealist comedy was too strange for mainstream television. Observational comedy about nothing would never work. Johnny Carson bet his money and his reputation that they were all wrong. In the early 1980s, American comedy was dominated by loud, physical performers who commanded stages through sheer energy and volume. Into this landscape came a comedian whose style defied every conventional rule, Stephen Wright. Wright's one-liners were surreal and delivered in perfect monotone. "I spilled spot remover on my dog, now he's gone." On paper, this should not have worked on The Tonight Show. Industry wisdom suggested this approach was too strange, too quiet, too intellectual for late-night television. But Johnny Carson saw genius where others saw commercial risk. When Wright appeared on The Tonight Show in 1982, Carson invited him to the couch during his debut appearance, a nearly unprecedented gesture. Wright spoke so quietly, the boom operator turned to the director and mouthed, "I can't hear him," but the laughs came not chuckles, explosions. The conversation revealed Wright's brilliant, off-kilter mind, and Carson was genuinely delighted. But Carson didn't stop there. He booked Wright again less than a week later. Booking a comedian twice in 1 week was virtually unprecedented. The message to the industry was unmistakable. Surrealist, dry comedy had a mainstream home. Wright's career launched immediately. Carson championed weird, but he also championed quiet, and that's where Jerry Seinfeld comes in. Seinfeld's material was clean and observational, built around everyday minutia, airline peanuts, grocery store frustrations, the small absurdities of modern life. When Seinfeld appeared on The Tonight Show in 1981, Carson gave him repeated appearances, each one proving that comedy about nothing could be genuinely entertaining. That validation became essential. Carson's repeated bookings told the industry that clean, observational comedy had mainstream appeal. When Seinfeld eventually pitched NBC on a sitcom built around everyday observations, executives were skeptical. But Seinfeld had something most unknown comics didn't: a track record on Carson's stage, proving that audiences would pay attention to comedy about nothing. The sitcom became one of television's most successful shows, running for 9 seasons and changing the landscape of American comedy. Carson didn't create Seinfeld single-handedly, but he had validated the approach years before anyone else was willing to bet on it. Carson could turn unknowns into icons with a single conversation, but when someone beat him in business, that's when America learned just how vindictive Johnny Carson could be. And Wayne Newton was about to discover that Carson's grudges could cost you everything. The Aladdin Hotel War, Wayne Newton won a fair business competition. For that, Johnny Carson spent 6 months destroying his career on national television, and it worked. Wayne Newton and Johnny Carson both bid on the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas in 1980. This was business, not personal. 2 entertainers making competing investment bids. Newton outmaneuvered Carson through better negotiation and stronger connections. Newton won fairly. Under normal circumstances, Carson would have moved on. But these weren't normal circumstances. Carson's producer later said, "Johnny never forgave business losses because he saw them as personal. If you beat him, you'd proven he wasn't the smartest guy in the room, and that was unforgivable." Instead of moving on, Carson began using The Tonight Show as a weapon. Night after night, Carson delivered jokes about Wayne Newton, most of them questioning his masculinity. Week 1, Newton laughed it off. Week 3, the jokes intensified. Newton's agent called Carson's people no response. Week 8, Newton lost a major casino booking because, as the owner said, Carson's audience won't come to see you. Week 12, Newton had had enough. Newton went to the studio. The confrontation escalated rapidly. Newton grabbed Carson by the collar and told him, "The jokes stop tonight, or I'm coming back." Carson's producers had to step between them. Security was called. Newton was escorted out and never allowed back. The consequences extended far beyond a single confrontation. Newton's booking fees dropped. Casino managers who had once competed for his residency now hesitated, worried that association with a Carson target would alienate the very tourists who filled their showrooms. Industry friends quietly distanced themselves, not because they disliked Newton, but because proximity to someone on Carson's bad side carried its own professional risk. Within 6 months, Newton had to sell his stake in the Aladdin at a loss, $2.8 million invested, sold for $1.9 million. Carson's nightly mockery had made him toxic to Vegas tourists who watched The Tonight Show religiously. Carson had lost a fair business competition, but he had used his media power to ensure Newton lost far more. While Carson was destroying Newton's career over a hotel, he was building the future of comedy, and his next creations would become icons, defining the next generation of entertainment. Two performers in particular, one already famous on Saturday Night Live, one doing subversive comedy in small clubs, needed Carson's blessing to become household names. The successors. Eddie Murphy was already on Saturday Night Live. David Letterman was already getting laughs. But without Johnny Carson's blessing, neither would have become household names. Eddie Murphy arrived at The Tonight Show in 1982, already on Saturday Night Live, already recognized by audiences. But SNL fame didn't automatically translate to broader mainstream success. Murphy needed validation from middle America, recognition from the viewers who watched Carson. Carson provided that validation through the way he treated Murphy during their conversations. He didn't interview Murphy as a novelty or a rising talent. He treated him as a peer, an equal in the world of entertainment. For older viewers who might not stay up for SNL, Carson's respect signaled that Eddie Murphy wasn't just a flash-in-the-pan SNL performer, but a genuine talent worth following into film. Those Tonight Show appearances were essential for facilitating Murphy's transition into movies. David Letterman's comedy was subversive and ironic, ahead of its time in the late 1970s. What really mattered was Carson's decision to make Letterman a preferred guest host. Letterman proved himself night after night. By 1982, Carson had seen enough. But NBC had another candidate for late night, David Brenner, Carson's most frequent guest host with over 150 appearances. The safe choice. The obvious choice. Brenner was reliable, familiar to audiences, and beloved by affiliates. On paper, there was no reason to take a risk. But Carson had watched Letterman guest host and seen something Brenner didn't have, an edge. Letterman pushed the format. He took risks. He made the audience slightly uncomfortable and then won them back. That willingness to fail and the intelligence to recover from it was what Carson recognized as the future of late night. Carson chose Letterman anyway. When NBC hesitated, Carson made his position clear. It's Letterman, or I start talking to ABC about moving my show. NBC gave Letterman the job. Brenner found out on the news. He called Carson's line. Carson's assistant answered. "I need to speak to Johnny." The assistant. "He said you'd call. He told me to tell you he's made his choice, and it's final." Click. 150 appearances, 8 years of friendship, ended with the secretary's message. Letterman went on to host late-night television for 33 years, becoming one of the most influential figures in American entertainment. But in 1982, none of that was guaranteed. What mattered was that Johnny Carson had used his power to give Letterman the platform that would define his career. Carson could make stars with a gesture, but he could also end careers for violations that seemed impossibly small, like performing a magic trick the wrong way, or being rude to the wrong person. And two legends were about to learn that fame provided no immunity from Carson's standard. Craft violations. Orson Welles was a cinematic genius. Jerry Lewis was a comedy legend. Neither was ever invited back to The Tonight Show. Their crimes? One used plants in a magic trick. The other insulted a 60-year-old cue card man. For Orson Welles, the end came during an appearance where he performed a magic trick using plants in the audience pre-selected people who knew the trick in advance. Carson, who had trained as a magician, viewed this as unforgivable. In magic, using plants is the ultimate sin. It's not magic anymore. It's just lying. The playing card Welles used was a red-back deck, the kind casinos had banned in Vegas for being too easy to mark. Carson saw Welles do it live. He never said a word on air. The interview continued normally. But the next day, Welles's booking agent got a one-sentence message. "Mr. Welles will not be invited back." Jerry Lewis's exile came from a different violation. During a Tonight Show appearance in 1975, the show's writers made last-minute changes to the script, requiring the cue card man to quickly update the cards. It was a normal part of live television production. 3 stagehands heard Lewis call the cue card man a brainless union slug and threatened to have him fired. The man was 60 years old, had worked 3 decades in television, and was doing exactly what the script changes required. Carson heard about it during a commercial break. The interview finished. Lewis took his bow. He never got another invitation. What made these bans so telling was that neither Wells nor Lewis had wronged Carson personally. There was no business rivalry, no betrayal, no public slight. These were purely about standards. Carson had spent his entire career believing that the people behind the camera, the stagehands, the lighting crew, the cue card holders, were the backbone of every show. And he believed that the audience deserved honesty, whether they were watching a comedy set or a magic trick. If you violated those principles, it didn't matter how famous you were. It didn't matter how many movies you'd made or how many standing ovations you'd received. Carson's door was closed. Both bands revealed Carson's core values with perfect clarity. Craft mattered, you didn't cheat your audience with fake magic. Respect mattered, crew members deserved dignity regardless of their position. Talent didn't excuse abuse. Fame didn't justify cruelty. And professional success provided no immunity from consequences. By Carson's final year as host, the television world had changed. Cable was expanding. MTV was creating stars. Arsenio Hall had launched a show in 1989 that proved stars could be made without Carson's blessing. Some wondered if Carson's couch invitation even mattered anymore. One comedian was about to find out if the Pope's blessing still worked in the new world of 1991. The Pope's final blessing? It was 1991. The television landscape had fractured. Cable, MTV, Arsenio Hall, new platforms, were creating stars without Carson's help. Some wondered if the couch invitation even mattered anymore. Drew Carey was about to find out. Carey had been working clubs in Cleveland, building a following the old-fashioned way. He knew the industry had changed, but he sought Carson's endorsement anyway, understanding that despite all the new platforms, Johnny Carson's opinion might still carry weight. It was a calculated gamble. If Carson's power had faded, this appearance would be just another credit on his resume. Carey walked onto that stage not knowing if he was meeting a legend or chasing a ghost. Carson invited Carey to the couch during his debut appearance, one of the final times he would ever extend that rare invitation. Carey later described the moment as receiving the Pope's blessing. The comparison was exact. Like the Pope, Carson's power came from tradition, from decades of being proven right, from institutional authority that transcended the current moment. Within 72 hours of his Tonight Show appearance, Carey got calls from ABC, CBS, and NBC. All 3 wanted him, not just interest, actual offers. The bidding war lasted 2 weeks. Network executives who'd never heard of Drew Carey were suddenly competing for his signature. Agents who had never returned his calls were now leaving messages with his answering service. The speed was the point. In a world of fragmented media, Carson's endorsement still functioned like a signal flare visible to everyone in the industry at once. One appearance, one couch invitation, and every decision-maker in Hollywood knew the same thing at the same time. This guy has it. Before Carson, Carey was worth $50,000 a year in club bookings. After Carson, he signed a deal worth $500,000 per season, a 10 times multiplier. Those offers led directly to The Drew Carey Show, which premiered in 1995, ran for 9 years, and turned Carey into a household name. The show aired on ABC for 233 episodes. Drew Carey didn't know it when he sat down, but he was the last comedian who would ever receive Johnny Carson's couch invitation on debut. 3 months later, Carson announced his retirement. The era was over. The fact that it still worked, that Carson's blessing still launched Carey's career in 1991, in an era of MTV and cable and Arsenio, demonstrated that his judgment had become its own form of cultural capital. It was valuable not because Carson controlled all the platforms anymore, but because 3 decades of accurate predictions had established his opinion as something worth trusting. When Johnny Carson said you were funny, the new platforms couldn't replicate that certainty. But before Carson left that desk for the final time, one more star would learn what happened when you violated every rule Carson held sacred, all in a single appearance. And the lesson was so brutal, the star still doesn't understand what he did wrong. His name? The biggest television star in America. Captain Kirk himself. 3 rules broken in one night. William Shatner was Captain Kirk. He'd conquered television. But in one appearance on The Tonight Show, he managed to break 3 unwritten rules Carson held sacred. It destroyed any chance of ever coming back. William Shatner arrived at The Tonight Show in 1983 with the kind of fame that should have guaranteed a successful appearance. He was Captain Kirk, the star of one of television's most beloved science fiction series. But that appearance managed to violate every unwritten rule Carson held sacred. The first violation came when Shatner began speaking in a monotone for 4 minutes. This was William Shatner, famous for his dramatic pauses, his theatrical delivery, his ability to turn a simple sentence into a Shakespearean event, speaking like a bored robot reading a tax form. Carson tried 12 different questions. Shatner gave 12 identical flat responses. The studio audience started coughing, the universal sign of comedy ending poorly. The second violation was even more egregious. Shatner literally turned his entire body away from Carson to talk to another guest, a young actress who'd just arrived. Carson sat there, on camera, with nothing to do. For 45 seconds, Johnny Carson was invisible on his own show. The host controls the conversation. The host directs the flow. By turning his back and taking control, Shatner had essentially hijacked the segment. The director didn't even know where to point the cameras. But Shatner wasn't finished. Then he said the words that sealed his exile. "I've got a new show coming to ABC next month." He'd just promoted Carson's direct competitor on Carson's show on NBC. The studio went completely still. Not silent quiet in the way a room goes quiet when someone has made a mistake so obvious that everyone recognizes it, except the person who made it. Carson's smile disappeared. The interview ended 90 seconds later. The next morning, Shatner's publicist called The Tonight Show to discuss future appearances. The booking coordinator's response was brief. "There won't be any." William Shatner never received another invitation to The Tonight Show. One rule broken might be excused as nerves. 2 violations suggested poor judgment. 3 violations in a single appearance signaled complete ignorance of television's basic professional standards or deliberate disrespect. In a 1995 interview, Shatner said he didn't even remember the appearance. When told about the violations, he laughed it off. Johnny was too sensitive. He never understood what he'd done wrong, and that was exactly the problem. The end of an era. For 30 years, Johnny Carson sat behind that desk and decided who would become a star and who would disappear into obscurity. 7 careers made, 5 destroyed. You know the names, they're still on your screen, or they're conspicuously absent. Joan Rivers, Ellen DeGeneres, Stephen Wright, Jerry Seinfeld, Eddie Murphy, David Letterman, Drew Carey each received the couch invitation that changed everything. Joan Rivers again, Wayne Newton, Orson Welles, Jerry Lewis, William Shatner, they learned that Carson's standards were absolute. Betrayal of personal loyalty, inability to accept business losses, dishonesty in craft, abuse of staff, and basic disrespect for professional courtesy. Each violation carried the same penalty: permanent banishment from the most important platform in American media. That power came from standards Carson enforced with complete consistency: loyalty, honesty in your craft, respect for the people who made television possible, and basic professional courtesy. These weren't negotiable. They applied equally to legends and newcomers. By 1989, Carson's monopoly over American celebrity began to fracture. Cable television, MTV, Arsenio Hall, new platforms emerged that could create stars without Carson's blessing. When Carson retired in 1992, he took that singular influence with him. It has never been replicated. No single person will ever again wield the kind of power Johnny Carson held over American entertainment. The couch is gone. The era is over. Johnny Carson remains the last person who could make or destroy a career with a single gesture: "Come sit beside me." But one mystery remains. Carson passed away in 2005. His estate auctioned off his desk, his suits, his Emmy Awards. But one item never appeared: the list. Burt Reynolds swore it existed. Johnny had a list in his head, Reynolds said in a 2012 interview. He'd reference it. I heard him say once, "That name's on page 2, which meant there were multiple pages, dozens of names, maybe hundreds. A lifetime of judgments, loyalties honored and betrayed, grudges held so long they outlasted the careers they were meant to punish. Carson's son Rick was asked in 2015 if he'd ever seen it written down. His answer? Once. In my father's study, after he passed away. It was in his handwriting. I burned it. Why? The interviewer asked. Because some grudges, Rick said, should end with the men who held them. And because I saw my mother's name on it. He never said why. If you enjoyed this journey into television's golden age, Please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from classic Hollywood. Let us know in the comments below which star you want us to investigate next.